The sun lay heavy over the summer plains, its heat trembling across the horizon as if the whole world were breathing through fevered lungs. Dust drifted in lazy veils across the open road, stirred by winds too tired to carry themselves far. Every fence post shimmered, every blade of grass bowed under the weight of the afternoon blaze. On days like this, when the land seemed to whisper its truths through heat mirages and cicada cries, Carver believed a man could see the world more clearly if only because everything extraneous felt stripped away. Yet clarity, he would learn, was its own kind of mirage. The truth he sought was not lying in the road ahead but hidden within the quiet chambers of his own fear. Wees rode with his hat pulled low, a dust-stained shirt sticking to his back, though he was usually a man known for his meticulous neatness. The territory recognized him as the wealthiest rancher for nearly 100 miles, heir to sprawling acres and herds that thundered like living storms across the range. But money never softened him. The frontier had raised him harder than wealth could smooth away. He was a man who valued silence, integrity, and hands that bore the proof of labor. Yet he also carried a quieter wound, one seeded long ago, when someone he once trusted had loved not him but the land his father left behind. Since then, affection felt like a gamble played blind. His engagement to Hart was not arranged in cold terms, not exactly. Both families approved, and Wees had agreed because something about her, her stillness, her gentleness, the way she moved as though listening to a music no one else heard, had sparked a soft, almost reluctant hope in him. But hope, he feared, tempted disappointment, and disappointment tempted ruin. So before the union was set in stone, he devised a plan as old as mistrust itself. Approach her not as the wealthy rancher, but as any hired hand passing through. Let her reveal her heart without knowing his name. Thatcher Hale, his foreman and closest confidant, had warned him. You're courting trouble, Wees. If you go for truths in disguise, you might find more than you can stomach. Wees answered with a weary half-smile because he already knew that. But something hollow had opened inside him after their last brief meeting. Polite sweetness, her careful smiles, her elegant posture all seemed too untouched by genuine affection. He couldn't bear to tie his life to a woman who might greet him with civility, but never with warmth. The Hart homestead appeared at last through the heat shimmer, a whitewashed house, edges softened by sun glare, a porch shaded by cottonwoods whose leaves barely rustled. A horse stirred lazily near the post. Chickens nested under the porch steps. It was humbler than he expected, quieter, as though the place held its breath against the world's louder cruelties. He dismounted, tying his reins loosely, and then he saw her. Hart stood at the porch rail, brushing dust from her skirts. Her hair, a soft brown touch by sunlight, was pinned loosely, tendrils sticking to her neck from the heat. Her face held the kind of beauty that didn't announce itself, it simply existed, gentle and unforced. She looked tired, though, shadows beneath her eyes suggesting heavy thoughts. Wees felt something stir painfully in his chest. She was real, human, and perhaps lonelier than the stories told. Before he could speak, another figure swanned onto the porch, Ruby's cousin, dressed in silk too fine for the heat. Lips painted dark, her voice already sharpened for gossip. She drawled, "Did you hear? Carver's set on marrying you. Imagine that. Half the women in the county would kill for that name." The shoulders tensed. "Please, Ruby, don't start." Ruby laughed lightly, tapping her parasol against her palm. "You should be grateful. A man like that could change your life. If you play your cards right, you'll never work another day, and if you play them wrong, well," her eyes glittered, "he'll see you for what you are, ordinary." Wees froze in the yard, heart pounding. He was close enough to hear them clearly, but hidden by the slant of the porch and the glare of the sun. He waited, half terrified, half desperate, for to defend herself, to reject the notion of caring for wealth. Instead, he heard her sigh, long and defeated. "I barely know him," murmured, picking at the worn wood of the railing. "And if he's anything like the other ranch lords, proud, untouchable, why would he care for my heart anyway? Ruby, can't we stop talking about this? I'm tired of being pushed towards something I never asked for." Her words struck Wees like a misfired bullet, glancing off truth but piercing pride. She wasn't gold-hungry, but she also wasn't interested in him. Not truly, not the man beneath the ranch acres. She sounded weary of the idea of him, dismissive even, as though already bracing herself for a disappointment she believed inevitable. The ache he had feared settled into place, cold, deliberate. Ruby spotted Wees in the yard and waved a careless hand. "New hired help, I suppose. Put him to work before he melts into the dirt." Turned, her expression shifting into polite formality. "We could use an extra hand," she said gently. "The horses need watering and the heat's been cruel to them. If you're looking for work, you're welcome to stay a while." Her kindness only deepened the twist in his chest. She didn't see him, only the dust-covered stranger she believed him to be, so he nodded, voice steady though his heart was. "Yes, ma'am, I can help." She offered a faint smile, tired, polite, but real. It wasn't flirtation, it wasn't interest, it was simply grace. In the stable, the air felt marginally cooler, though it smelled of sweat, hay, and summer-worn leather. Horses shifted restlessly, irritated by flies. We's fetched water, moving with practiced ease. Joined him briefly to check on an older mare whose ribs showed faintly beneath her hide. She's struggled in this heat, murmured, stroking the mare's neck with tender patience. Some creatures wear their burdens where everyone can see, others hide them under better skin. Her words unsettled him. They sounded like a confession whispered to the wrong ears. A sudden gust sent dust swirling through the doorway, lifting the ends of her hair. She brushed it back, unaware of how the simple motion softened her whole face. Wee's pulse tightened. Here she was, kind, thoughtful, worn down by pressures she never invited, and he, foolishly disguised, carried a misunderstanding already growing poisonous inside him. He meant to observe her for one day, maybe two, to see if she sought wealth or companionship. But now he found himself wanting to understand her, wanting to step closer, wanting to unburden the heaviness in her eyes. Instead, he remained silent. As evening settled, a faint orange glow spread across the plains, softening the sting of heat. Stepped out onto the porch, thinking the yard empty, unaware Wees lingered by the barn door's shadow. I wish, she whispered into the quiet, that someone would see me for who I am, not what marriage might make me. The words floated toward him, fragile as drifting embers. And for a breathless moment he felt the truth of her, not greedy, not shallow, but heart-worn and afraid of being misunderstood. He should have stepped forward then, should have told her his name, his fear, his foolish test. Instead, he let the moment pass. And in that silence, the first lie tightened its hold. The summer days stretched long, their light lingering over the plains like a held breath, too bright and too heavy to ignore. Morning heat rose early, curling through the Hart property in shimmering waves, settling on every surface with slow insistence. Wesley Carver woke before dawn each day, slipping into the role of a simple hired hand with the ease of a man used to labor. Dust clung to his boots, sweat beaded at his collar, and the ache in his chest, born from overheard words and unspoken fears, rode quietly beside him. Still, he worked, because work was the only place where his mind didn't unravel itself into doubts. Hart stepped into the yard each sunrise with the same quiet determination. She looked softer in those early hours, the golden light brushing her face into something almost luminous, yet her movements betrayed a deep tiredness as though she carried burdens no one else could see. Wees watched her discreetly, taking note of every small kindness that shaped her days, moments so subtle they might slip unnoticed by anyone else. But to him, they were revelations. The heat returned, settling over the ranch like a second skin. Dust clouds lifted from the road as townsfolk passed by, calling greetings or whispering gossip depending on their nature. Baron Pike rode through twice that week, stopping only long enough to make his presence felt. A man with polished boots and an even more polished pride, he eyed with a possessiveness that made Wee's jaw tighten. The town had begun murmuring again, rumors about marrying up, about her family depending on it, about her being too plain to win affection without fortune trailing behind. Wees heard every whisper, and though they weren't aimed at him, he felt each one like a grain of grit under the skin. His disguise forced him to listen without intervening, to watch the woman he was meant to marry shrink a little more beneath a weight she never invited. Yet for all her weariness, never allowed bitterness to settle. One scorching afternoon, while Wees hauled water to the horse troughs, she approached quietly with a tin cup glistening with cool well water. The ice had already melted, but condensation still clung to the metal. "You look overheated," she said, gently offering it to him. "Please, the heat takes more out of a man than pride admits." Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, as though kindness were something she feared might be misinterpreted. Wees accepted the cup, meeting her eyes for the briefest moment. In that instant, the disguise felt unbearably heavy. She believed he was nothing more than a drifter seeking work, yet she looked at him with a softness that contradicted the sharpness of her earlier words to Ruby. He drank slowly, more from wanting to prolong the moment than from thirst. "You're thoughtful, Miss Hart," he said quietly. She blinked, surprised by the sincerity. Not thoughtful, just aware when someone's struggling. He realized she was speaking of herself as much as him. Later that day, a stable boy dropped an armload of brushes and tack, wincing as Ruby scolded him for the noise. The boy's hands trembled, he stammered an apology. Before Ruby could continue her tirade, intervened. She placed herself between them and spoke with a calm firmness that startled even Wees. "It's only equipment, Ruby, no harm done." Ruby scoffed, "You're too soft, that's why people walk over you." His jaw tightened, but she said nothing more. Wees, watching from behind a stack of hay bales, felt something shift inside him. Her gentleness wasn't weakness, it was resistance, quiet, persistent, and steadfast. That evening, golden light draped the ranch like a blessing that no one quite deserved. Knelt beside an aging mare suffering from heat rash, dabbing ointment along the irritated skin. Wees crouched nearby, holding the jar for her. The proximity made the air feel even warmer. "She's stubborn," murmured, brushing the mare's muzzle. "She pushes through discomfort without letting anyone see how much she hurts." Weez looked at her instead of the horse. I reckon that's truer of people than animals. Their eyes met, brief, charged, and quickly broken as she looked down. She didn't blush, but her breath caught just slightly, a sign of some emotion she couldn't or wouldn't name. As days passed, these moments accumulated, soft, fragile threads forming something that felt dangerously like attachment. Weez found himself anticipating the sound of her footsteps, the way she tucked stray hair behind her ear, the faint crease between her brows when she read letters from town. She wasn't the woman he feared she might be. And yet he could not let go of her earlier confession, her belief that a ranch lord like him could never care for her heart. Those words had burrowed deep, anchoring doubt where affection could have flourished. One afternoon, after a long morning of work, Weez overheard Baron Pike speaking to a pair of townsmen near the fence line. Pike's voice carried easily, sharpened by arrogance. "Hart's setting her sights on Carver's fortune," he declared. "If she manages to snag him, she'll rise on his coattails. Girl knows she's got nothing else to offer." Weez felt heat rise in his chest, anger, confusion, protectiveness tangled like barbed wire. But as a servant, he had no right to speak. He swallowed the retort burning on his tongue, yet the words still pierced, not because he believed them, but because he knew heard whispers like these every week. And each whisper carved a little deeper into her self-worth. That evening she left the dinner table early and wandered out toward the old corral. Weez followed at a respectful distance, drawn not by curiosity but something akin to worry. She stood by the fence, hands clasped, staring at the horizon where the sun bled into dusky red. "Hard day?" Weez asked quietly. She startled, then managed a small smile. "Just noise. It's loud out here even when the world looks empty." He understood gossip was its own kind of thunder. Wind lifted the hem of her dress, brushing dust from her boots. For a moment, she looked like someone standing on the edge of choosing who she wanted to become. She turned toward him, eyes full of questions she couldn't yet voice. "Do you ever feel," she said slowly, searching for words, "like people see only the version of you that suits their expectations?" Weez's throat tightened every day. A silence stretched between them, gentle, heavy, honest. She held his gaze. "Then I hope whoever you really are beneath all this finds someone who notices." He nearly told her everything right then. His real name, his real fears, his real intentions. The words balanced on his tongue, trembling like horses before a storm. But before he could speak, the distant clatter of hooves shattered the moment. A rider approached fast, Ruby rushing across the yard, skirts flaring, face flushed with urgency. She cried, "You need to come inside. There's news, you won't like it." "Stiffened, what news?" Ruby hesitated just long enough for dread to bloom. "It's about Carver," she said, "and his plans for your engagement." Weez felt the world tilt, the air thinning around him. Ruby's next words, still unspoken, were already forming a noose around every hope he'd allowed himself to feel. The sky dimmed earlier than it should have, as if dusk were hurrying toward the land with a secret too heavy to hold. Clouds gathered in the distance, dark, swollen shapes that pulsed with violet edges, while the wind shifted from warm to restless. Weez felt the change as he worked along the corral fence, the air turning thick, the horses tossing their heads uneasily. Storms on the prairie had a way of stripping truth bare, peeling back every veneer until only what mattered remained. He wondered with grim irony whether this one would do the same to him. Emerged from the house with Ruby close behind, their skirts catching in the rising wind. The expression was drawn, her hands clasped tight as though she were holding herself together. Weez could see from a distance that whatever Ruby had told her had sunk its claws deep. She looked shaken, not angry, not bitter, but hollowed out by something whispered too carelessly. He moved toward them, unable to stay still. His disguise felt suffocating, a lie pressing down harder than the storm clouds above. Lifted her gaze as he approached. Her eyes shimmered with questions, with fear she didn't fully understand. Ruby, always eager to command attention, stepped between them with her chin raised. "No need to look concerned, ranch hand," Ruby said sharply. "This doesn't involve you." Weez ignored her, focusing on, "Is everything all right?" Tried to steady her voice. She says Carver is reconsidering the engagement, that he thinks poorly of me, she swallowed hard, that he believes I'm chasing his fortune." Weez felt the ground tilt beneath him. Ruby had woven half-truths into daggers and had borne each one without defense. He wanted to tell her the truth, that the man she feared disappointing was the same man standing before her, but the words snagged on his own guilt. Ruby huffed, "It's only natural. Men like him see right through desperation." Flinched as though struck, and Weez's temper snapped like a dry twig. "You speak of things you don't understand," he said, voice low, dangerous. Ruby scoffed, "Oh, and you do." The wind answered before Weez could, sweeping across the yard in a howl that lifted dust and tossed loose straw. A distant rumble of thunder followed, vibrating through the ground. Marshall Crowder rode into view, pulling his horse hard as he approached. "Storm's rolling in fast," he warned. "Best secure everything, this one looks mean." He tipped his hat and galloped toward the next homestead, leaving the tension between the three of them suspended in the air, thick as the gathering clouds. Skay softened for a single heartbeat as she looked at Wheeze. "Why do you defend me?" she whispered. "You barely know me." He opened his mouth, ready, finally, to confess something real, something that might untangle the knots between them. But Ruby stepped in again, grabbing his wrist. "We need to prepare the house," she insisted. "This storm won't wait for your tender moments." Wheeze clenched his jaw, watching, pulled inside like a leaf carried by current. The truth had been within reach, so close he could almost feel its relief, but again he'd let it slip through his fingers. Rain began to fall minutes later, first in scattered droplets, then in fierce sheets that hammered the roof and churned the yard into mud. Thunder cracked overhead, lightning splitting the sky into jagged white scars. Wheeze worked quickly, securing the livestock, checking the barn doors, tightening every latch until the wind tore at his coat like a living thing. Through the storm's roar, he heard the frightened whinny of a horse and rushed toward the smaller shed behind the barn. Inside, he found struggling to calm a young colt panicked by the thunder. Her hair clung to her cheeks, her dress soaked through from running out in the storm. She shouldn't have been there, no one should have, but her instinct to protect outweighed every risk. "Miss Hart," he called, pushing through the door as lightning illuminated the sky in a violent flash. She turned toward him, breathless. He broke out of the pen when the wind shifted. "I couldn't just leave him." Wheeze moved to help her, speaking softly to the colt until its frantic movements eased. Another crack of thunder shook the ground, startling. She instinctively grabbed his arm, fingers trembling. The warmth of her touch through the wet fabric felt like a confession neither of them dared speak aloud. "You shouldn't be out here," Wheeze said, feeling the storm in his bloodstream. "It isn't safe." She met his gaze, rain streaking her face like tears she refused to shed. "I'm tired of being afraid," she whispered. Before he could respond, the shed shuddered violently as the wind ripped at the roof. A beam groaned near the corner. Wheeze reacted instinctively, pulling to him, shielding her as debris cracked in the rafters. "We need to get out," he said urgently. Together, they dashed into the tempest. Mud sucked at their boots, wind clawed at their clothes, and the rain blurred everything into a swaying canvas of movement and noise. Wheeze held her hand tightly, guiding her toward the barn. The world around them felt reduced to instinct: protect her, keep her close, survive the storm. Inside the barn, the lanterns flickered wildly, shadows leaping like restless spirits. Leaned against a stall door, catching her breath. We stood before her, feeling the weight of everything unsaid pressing against his ribs. "Why?" she asked softly, voice barely audible over the storm. "Why do you care so much? You act like my pain matters to you, like my fears aren't mine alone." He swallowed, heart pounding, "Because they shouldn't be yours alone." Her eyes searched his face, trembling with a fragile hope she didn't understand. The truth hovered on his tongue, his real name, his real intentions, the real reason he'd come disguised and let misunderstanding fester. He could see how desperately she needed something steady, something honest, something she could finally trust. But lightning struck nearby, so close the barn shook, interrupting the moment. A new sound followed, the rapid rise of water rushing along the low edge of the property. His eyes widened, the creek, it's overflowing. We stepped toward the barn door, peering out into the storm. Sure enough, water swept across the land in a fast-moving sheet, surging toward the lower sheds. The smaller one, the one she'd just rescued the colt from, buckled under the flood's force. A gasp escaped her. "That shed, my father built it." Lightning flared again. The shed collapsed fully, carried off its foundation by the water's force. Pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, grief spilling from her eyes. We felt something seize inside him, a fierce protective ache that left no room for disguise or distance. He turned back to her, rain still dripping from his hair, the storm raging behind him. He said, voice raw, "There's something you need to know." But before he could speak, Thatcher Hale burst into view through the barn door, shouting above the thunder. "Carver, we need you at the ridge now." Froze. She heard the name. The name struck the air like a rifle report, sharp, undeniable, impossible to ignore. Stood motionless, her breath caught between disbelief and the storm still raging beyond the barn walls. Wheeze felt the world constrict around him, the lie he had carried unraveling in an instant, threads snapping with every syllable of his true name. Thatcher Hale waited at the threshold, water streaming from his coat, urgency burning in his eyes, but the greater storm was happening between the two souls inside the lantern-lit barn. His lips parted, stunned. "Carver," her voice trembled not with anger at first, but with a quiet, breaking confusion. The man she thought a wandering hired hand stood before her, soaked and disheveled, every line of his face now illuminated with truth she should have known, truth he had hidden. The lie had not been cruel in intent, but cruelty often bloomed from the gentlest seeds. Weez took a single step toward her, the barn floor creaking under his boots. He murmured, rain sliding from his jaw, "I was going to tell you tonight, right before." Her voice, soft but wounded, cut through him. "You should have told me from the beginning." Thunder rolled across the plains as if agreeing. The lantern above them flickered, shadows trembling like startled birds. She backed away a fraction, her hand brushing the wooden stall door for balance. "You let me speak freely because you hid who you were. You let me be ashamed of myself. You listened to words never meant to wound you, and you kept silent while they did." We felt each accusation land with the weight of truth. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid you'd want the ranch, the fortune, the name, not the man. I needed to know," he exhaled, the admission raw. "I needed to know your heart before I offered you mine." Shook her head with slow disbelief. "And did you think disguising yourself would show you my heart? Did you believe deception could lead you to honesty?" A tear cut through the dirt on her cheek. "All this time I was trying to make peace with a future I feared would disappoint a man I'd never met, while the man himself was standing inches away, judging me from behind a mask." Weez reached for her hand, but she drew it back. The loss of that simple touch hollowed him. Thatcher's voice broke through the moment again. "Weez, the ridge lightning set the dry brush on fire, it's spreading fast." Weez turned to him, torn in two directions. "How bad?" "Bad enough to threaten the cattle pens and maybe the town if the wind shifts. We need men now." Weez pivoted back to heart straining between duty and the truth clawing for air. "Please," he whispered, "let me fix this, then I'll answer everything. You deserve every truth I." She didn't speak, only nodded stiffly, her expression unreadable. Thatcher was already mounted and heading toward the ridge. We sprinted toward the yard, finding his horse trembling but ready. As he swung into the saddle, he heard his voice carried faintly by the storm wind, soft, pained, and unsure whether she spoke to him or herself. "I don't know who you are anymore." The words chased him as he rode into the darkness. Lightning split the sky into jagged pieces. Smoke curled up like black ribbons, thick and choking, stinging his eyes as he neared the ridge. The fire roared through the brush with ravenous speed, flames snapping at the dry grass, devouring everything in its path. Men shouted orders, forming a line with buckets, blankets, anything they could find to beat back the inferno. Weez joined them without hesitation, his muscles burning as he hauled water, dragged smoldering brush aside, and shouted warnings to men too close to collapsing branches. Heat pulsed against his face, sweat mixing with rain. For a moment, amid the chaos, he wondered if this blaze was merely a mirror of the one tearing through his own carefully guarded world, untamed, unforgiving, devouring the lies he had crafted to protect himself. Then a frantic cry cut through the storm. The cattle pens, fire, jumped the creek. Wee's heart seized. The herd could be lost, hundreds of lives, the foundation of ranch livelihoods and her family's included. He spurred his horse toward the lower field. Lightning illuminated the scene in stark flashes, tongues of flame racing through the grass, terrified cattle pressing against the fence, hooves churning mud into chaos. As he approached, he saw a figure already there, skirts soaked, hair plastered to her face, lantern in hand.
"What?"
She was swinging the gate open, trying desperately to create a path for the cattle to escape to higher ground. We shouted her name, but thunder drowned him out. She pushed against the gate again as the fire clawed closer. He leapt from his horse and ran to her, grabbing the wooden beam before it collapsed under the pressure. Together, they forced the gate wide. The cattle surged through in a terrified wave, thundering past them toward safety. Stumbled, nearly falling into the mud, but Weez caught her by the waist, pulling her upright. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, fear, relief, and 1,000 unspoken truths flickering between them in the firelight. "You shouldn't be here," he said breathlessly. She shook her head. "This ranch is part of my future one way or another. I wasn't going to watch it burn." Her words struck deeper than she realized. Before he could respond, a flaming ember drifted onto the wooden fence behind them, igniting it instantly. Weez grabbed her hand. "We need to move now." They ran together across the pasture, the flames chasing their heels like ravenous wolves. Smoke burned their lungs, rain offered only meager relief, and the ground sucked at their boots. By the time they reached the higher ridge where men were gathering, the worst of the blaze had been contained. Exhausted, trembling, and soaked, collapsed to her knees. Weez knelt beside her, his breath ragged. The storm eased its fury then, the rain cooling the scorched earth, steam rising in ghostly curls. The danger had passed, but the tension between them had not. Weez turned to her slowly. "I never meant to hurt you. I only wanted to know if you could ever care for a man like me without the weight of his name." She looked up, eyes glistening, not with rage, but with something far more painful. "You think so little of yourself that you needed to hide, or so little of me that you believed I couldn't tell the difference between arrogance and goodness." He shook his head. "I thought too little of my worth and too little of the world beyond the ranch, but never of you." Silence stretched thick and trembling. At last she reached out not to take his hand but to touch the mud-streaked fabric over his heart. I needed honesty, Wheeze. I don't know how to trust the version of you I met if he was never real. He was real, Wheeze whispered. Every word, every moment with you was real. The lie was my name, not my heart. Something in her eyes softened, though fear still lingered. She opened her mouth to speak, but the sound of hooves approached Baron Pike, arriving late with a group of men, his coat immaculate despite the storm. Well, Pike sneered, surveying the aftermath, looks like obedience isn't the only thing this place lacks. His gaze landed on, you really will do anything for attention, won't you? Wheeze rose slowly, fury simmering, watch your mouth. Pike smirked, or what, you going to fire me from a job I don't have? Stood, voice clear despite exhaustion, leave Baron, you've said enough. Her spine straightened, her fear burned away by fire and truth. Pike stared, startled by the steel in her voice, then turned sharply and rode off into the thinning rain. Wheeze looked at her in awe, you're braver than you know. She met his gaze, and you're more than the mask you hid behind, but I need time to understand both truths. He nodded, heart aching but hopeful, then I'll wait for as long as it takes. The storm clouds parted, revealing the first quiet shimmer of dawn. Stepped closer, placing her hand lightly in his, not a promise but a beginning. And in that fragile touch, the lie fell away, leaving only the raw, unguarded truth of two hearts finally willing to be seen.